Sure. Hi, this is Mike Edelhart. I'm here with another edition of Inception, our podcast about beginnings of new companies, new ideas in science and science-based consumer goods, sometimes even a little glimpse of the future. We get all that in the package today, I think, here with the first of these for the new year. Talking with Chris Bryson, New School Foods, just about our most recent investment. Maybe not the most recent, but certainly we invested in you guys just like it feels like days ago. So welcome, welcome to the portfolio, welcome to the podcast. So let's start out with the basics. So what is New School Foods, and why did you feel like that was the best use of your time, your talents, would produce the greatest impact and value and all that kind of thing?
Well, thanks. Firstly, thanks for having me, Mike. It's a real pleasure. Excited to be on the podcast today. And yeah, that's a great question. So New School Foods itself is a company that makes whole cut meat alternatives. And so when we use the term whole cut, what we mean is a fillet, for example, like a fillet of fish, or you could also think of that as a steak, for if we're talking about a beef steak. We are specifically focused on seafood applications. So our first product that we're working on is itself a fillet of salmon. But stepping back, I think what's really exciting, or what gets me out of bed every day, is that we've developed our own proprietary technology for creating, in a very scalable way, for recreating the texture of meat, or specifically fish. And that's really comes down to the fibrousness, the mouthfeel that you get. So yeah, I mean, I could unpack that or talk about it ad nauseum, but that's really what New School Foods is about at its core. Excuse me.
Got it. So it's a leading question. I sort of know the answer, but are you a food nerd? Are you some other kind of nerd? Were you a chef or something? You came to this, and this wasn't necessarily the most obvious thing.
No,
given where you started, right?
No, it really wasn't. In fact, I wasn't really intending to start a company. So this is actually my second startup, and I was hoping to take some time off. Prior to this, I was in the software industry, and I built a company named Unata that effectively built e-commerce software for major grocery chains to sell their groceries online. And the company was acquired by Instacart back in 2018. And like I said, I spent the better part of a decade working crazy hours, and I was hoping to take some time off. But as soon as there was a little bit more time in my schedule, I happened to learn all about our food system and how scary it is, how unsustainable it is. And I just felt very motivated and compelled to get involved. So I first got involved in the space as an angel investor, because to your point, I don't have a cooking background or chef background or a food science background. So I didn't feel that starting a company in this space was the best way I could help out. I figured I could probably help through coaching, through angel investments and things of that nature. But it didn't take long before I got the itch to get back, I guess, in the driver's seat. And but a lot of starting New School Foods was inspired by that experience with angel investment. I think after a couple of years, I just I felt that a lot of startups in this space weren't sufficiently prioritizing R&D, or they weren't able to prioritize R&D. And we started New School Foods in a little bit of a different way, but really built the company around R&D. So yeah, it's surprised. I did not expect to end up in the space. I mean, I can barely cook, never mind whether or not I have an engineering or a food science degree. So nonetheless, it's a really exciting space to be in.
Got it. And one of our other companies, which happens to be in recruiting and HR, the CEO said, I had no background in that, and that's why we won. That nobody with any background doing this ever would have thought of what we thought of, never would have done it, would have said, you can't do that, would have presumed that all kinds of other things were the natural way to go. And it feels like there's some of that here, because we look at a lot of companies in next generation food. We, like you, believe that food has to be decoupled from its traditional sources if we actually want to feed everybody. And we haven't seen anything like what you're doing in any other company. It seems to be really novel.
Yeah, I think I think there are a few benefits to outsiders moving into new industry, and so one is if I'm being candid, is ignorance. You know, the fact that you don't know how certain things work means that you might take certain risks that other people wouldn't take because you just don't know how crazy the risk is that you're taking. So, in some sense, that's sort of an advantage. I also think that having a fresh perspective and coming from a different industry allows you to question certain assumptions and try out things that maybe other people wouldn't have tried out. So to that notion, kind of going back to what you're saying about what we're doing in terms of it being different, when I was looking at a lot of the startups in this space, what sort of shocked me is that the majority of the companies 2-3 years ago that were getting started in the alternative protein space were riding on this massive high of companies like Beyond and Impossible creating this new industry, and everyone wanted to get in the game. What I noticed is that the majority of companies were just rushing to create a product and get it in front of investors so that they could get funding. So naturally what happens under those circumstances is everyone goes back to the same toolkit. And the problem with alternative proteins is the toolkit's pretty small. It's usually 2 or 3 proteins and 1 or 2 different processing methods. And so you end up with a lot of products that taste the same or have the same sort of texture. And I think, we probably all agree that alternative protein still has a ways to go, right? Not everyone has become plant-based. So that means we have an R&D gap to close. So New School Foods was really started in the spirit of finding new tools to add to the toolkit. So what we did is we doubled down on creating a novel processing technology to recreate the texture of meat, the fibrousness of meat, and in a way that hadn't been done before. And so we intentionally moved away from the existing methods that were already being used by everyone. And I think that maybe that willful ignorance or that blind ignorance and that willingness to question whether or not the current methods were adequate set us up for success. And if I'm being totally honest, there was a high probability when we underwent all this R&D that most of it wouldn't turn out. So we knew going in that when we invested in a lot of these R&D projects that we probably wouldn't be successful, but I think we got lucky.
So, and I'd say so. So let's talk a little bit about what it is. So we keep talking about this new approach.
Sure.
We haven't actually explained what is the new approach. Yeah. So to the extent you can, without sort of giving away the secrets, let everybody know just what you're doing that's different and why it produces the outcome you're looking for, which is meat and fish that are more like meat and fish.
Yeah, so to contextualize this, probably best to maybe first start with how most plant-based meats are made today, if that's okay with you. Sure. So today, the most commonly used process to create plant-based meat is a process called extrusion, or specifically high moisture extrusion. There is also another one called mix and form, but effectively, the extrusion-based process, which is quickly becoming the most common one, is a heat-based process. So the fundamental challenge with how that works is in order to create the fibrousness of meat. So if you think about meat really comes down to the texture of like all those different fibers moving in the same direction, right? So if you think about a steak and you pull it apart, or even a piece of chicken or fish, you have all these little fibers that are running or that are moving in the same direction. So we call those directionally aligned proteins or protein fibers. So extrusion can recreate that because what it does is it takes your plant protein ingredients, your protein isolates, and it heats them up to a crazy high temperature, and then it stretches them out into these fibers. And that's great. The challenge though is that you are heating and basically cooking those proteins. So you end up with a product that emerges pre-cooked. And if we're thinking about whole cuts, so whole cuts, like I said, the fillets applications, whole cuts as part of the overall meat industry, I think is well over 50% of the market, right? So the other half or the other minority segment being ground products or flaked products or things like that. The whole cut meat market is really the big opportunity. If you think about how whole cut products are sold in the grocery store, they're not sold pre-cooked, they're sold raw. And we know that companies like Beyond and Impossible and Just, they've been successful when they've placed their products side by side with the products that they're trying to emulate or serve as a substitute for. So if your product comes out of an extruder and it looks pre-cooked, and you're putting that next to a product that looks raw and that looks shiny and sort of gelatinous and semi-translucent, you're going to have this uncanny valley type experience as a consumer, where you look at the two products and they just don't look the same. And well before you put the product into your mouth, you're deciding whether or not to buy that product with your eyes, right? You're making that purchase decision based on appearance. So I think that's a very, very important aspect that that unfortunately today's existing solutions like extrusion, because it pre-cooks your product, don't address. Long-winded way of coming back to your question, which is we developed a cold-based process that does not cook those proteins. So our process is, which we were able to get a patent on, actually takes a gel and it restructures. We basically turn gels into scaffolds. So we first start by creating a scaffold that really recreates the structure of meat. So then we take these scaffolds and which have all these basically empty protein fiber channels, or these empty channels, and we're able to fill up those channels with our proteins and fats and colors and so forth, and flavors, excuse me. So it's a cold-based, freeze-based process that basically restructures gels into scaffolds, and then we can put our ingredients into them. I'm oversimplifying, but hopefully that helps.
Right. So it starts cold, it stays cold, and coming out the other end, it's therefore much more like the salmon before in the store than it would be. Also, there's in real food, if you want to call it, in food that comes out of nature, there's a certain chaos and randomness. It isn't as if there's meat, then there's muscle, then there's tissue, then there's meat, and it all sort of wanders around inside one another. And so if you want to create the look and feel and experience of the real thing, to a certain degree, you have to have some randomness in there. It just seems too orderly, and you've got that as well, that this process produces something that isn't too orderly, that doesn't look like a laminated set of different things masquerading.
Correct. Yeah, that's a very good point. And going back to what you said before about the product emerging raw, just to be clear, our goal is to create products that the consumer or the chef can take into their kitchen and can truly watch that product evolve, because the proteins themselves are not cooked. So when you cook the product, it does transition from raw to cooked, just like meat does. So it's a much more authentic, realistic experience. Speaking of authenticity and having that natural look, to your point, we've also spent a lot of time thinking about how we can recreate the bigger structure. So certainly you have the individual protein fibers, but to your point, especially within salmon, you have this very obvious structure of the orange or the pink tissue that is separated by the white connective tissue, all those white lines that run through. And you're right, there's a very interesting shape to it, and it's not necessarily, like you said, laminated where everything is exactly the same line. So we've spent a huge amount of time as an R&D team thinking about how we can recreate that broader macro structure and those white lines, and how those white lines somewhat melt when you cook it so that it starts to flake apart. So you're absolutely correct. I think creating something that feels natural is a very important step towards convincing consumers to adopt these alternative products.
Yeah. Well, when you cook a salmon fillet, it's that flakiness and the sort of spring, if you hit it with the back of your fingers and stuff, that you're looking for. And if you don't get it, you really won't be able to tell whether it's cooked, and it won't have the same mouthfeel.
Exactly. You're completely correct.
So you talked about all this experimentation and stuff, and being an angel investor, and you really sort of carry this on your back for a while. So we're in a very early raise, but you've been running this company and funding it yourself. Talk about that some. Why be all in that way? Why not go out and get other people's money and more help and all that earlier? Why carry so much of the burden through the early days yourself?
It's a really great question. I think that it's really interesting. Having had the previous company that exit under my belt, it was really interesting to see how investors approached me differently post sale as opposed to when I was doing my first funding round for my first company, where there weren't many investors who wanted to touch our business. And I remember after the sale, a few investors said, just make sure you tell me what your next business is. I'll cut a check for you. And I felt very conflicted about that. I wanted those investors to scrutinize our business. And so it was very important to me that before I asked for someone else's money, that I could prove, one, that I'd be willing to put in my own capital. And secondly, that I could look myself in the mirror and know that if I was going to take advantage of that amazing opportunity where I knew investors might be more willing to invest because this is my second company, I wanted to know in my heart of hearts that I truly had conviction around this business before I raised capital. I wanted to make sure that those investor dollars were going, whether it was to my company or another company, towards an opportunity that had real potential. Because at the end of the day, my goal in starting this company was really to create impact. So once again, this just goes to being able to have conviction and to make sure that the dollars that we were raising were going to the right place.
Got it. So now you have brought in some outside money from us and other helpful folks. And so where is the company right now? Where is the product right now? What do you see as what's likely to happen next?
Right. So we haven't yet announced the funding round, but that's going to happen within the coming weeks. The use of proceeds will be detailed, I think, in a little bit more, in more detail, I think, through the press release. But effectively, it's to allow us to scale up and grow and to move into a pilot operation. That's about the extent of what I can say. But we have been largely to date, an R&D centric team. We have had a lot of different laboratories working on different problems, whether that's texture or flavor, whether that's flavor development or flavor analysis. So we've been running somewhat covertly, but you'll certainly see a lot more from us this year. We're certainly looking to use that new capital to scale up and eventually bring our product to market.
Can't wait to see it. So it was your own money. You don't have any background. So how'd you get the expertise you needed to do this? Did you rent it? Did you hire it? Was it a mix of the above? Did the world's greatest food scientist happen to sit down next to you at the bar? How did you get what you needed?
It actually, oddly enough, it's a little bit of all three of those. So when I first got the inkling that there was an opportunity, two things really stood out when I was looking at all the startups. Obviously, the overarching theme was that we don't have enough R&D centric companies, but specifically the segments that interested me were whole cut applications, because it's the majority of the market, and I didn't feel like there was sufficient R&D specifically in that category. Additionally, the seafood category was something that just wasn't getting a lot of investment. There weren't many startups. So once that was clear to me, what I then did, because you're right, I didn't have the expertise. I then went to some friends at the Good Foods Institute, and I said, I'm looking to fund a lot of different academic research. What I wanted to do is put out a call for proposals to some of the best food science universities in the world and fund research for the better part of a year. And then the idea is, if you fund 6 projects, sort of like a portfolio approach, maybe one of those R&D projects bears fruit. And so I worked with some of the folks at GFI, who then later made some introductions to my eventual food science advisors. And then with the help of those advisors, we created 6 different calls for proposals for 6 different R&D projects. And we shared that with some of the best food science universities across the globe, in Canada, in the US, in Europe. We watched some of those proposals come in. We picked the ones we were most excited about. And then what we did that was a little bit different. Most academic projects, when you sponsor research, you cut them a check and then you get a paper from them 6 or 12 months later, which was not really, I don't know if it was because I was impatient or just too excited about what they were working on, but we decided to work in a much more collaborative fashion with our academic partners, where we would check in on a weekly basis and get updates We ran it more like a tech startup where the roadmap was very agile. We basically used the results from the prior week to inform where we were going, as opposed to saying, we want a paper that's on this one specific protein,
Right.
come hell or high water, we're only going
Right.
to do these experiments.
Right.
So that was great, and it allowed a lot of those R&D projects to meander and find success. And after the course of a year, one of those projects in particular identified this food structuring technology that turned into a patent. One of our other projects helped identify really some of the key compounds that are unique to salmon for recreating the flavor. Yeah, it was a mix of hiring some great advisors, getting advice from some people, sponsoring some research, and then some of those researchers actually ended up joining the team full time. So as the research started to bear fruit, we started investing more in the company and then started growing the full-time operation. Got it.
You know, when you describe it, it seems so natural, and yet it's an approach I hardly ever see. You're right. The academic side is that sort of, here's the check in a year and hope you get lucky. And often it's, I got to find one or two people. We're going to lock ourselves in a room, and this small group, we're going to get it right. And
exactly
the sort of portfolio management, if you want to call it that, or hedging a little bit, which is you don't know. You go in not knowing the outcome. So you got to have a lot of hands of poker going at once.
Exactly. Yeah, we wanted to have good odds. I mean, this is a big. Our food system is a really big global problem, and it's an elephant in the room for, I think, in most conversations. So I felt very motivated to increase the odds, and we also did get some funding from some Canadian government sources, so notably an organization called Protein Industries Canada. And I used that to match a lot of the capital that I put in to basically double our investment in R&D, to double our throughput in R&D. And that's why I'm so excited to actually be building the company here, even though I think we're only going to launch in the US first. I don't share that too much with our Canadian friends. And I think it's very important that the next generation of food companies be very economically minded, because we know that not only do we need to close the sensory gap, but there's also a price gap. And if these products are always going to be expensive, then they're always going to be a niche product. So that's why I'm so excited about building it here. I think we can build a more economically viable product here, even though we're going to be selling it predominantly into the United States.
Got it. Look forward to that. We actually felt the same, by the way, looking at you and the amount of progress you've been able to make for very small amounts of cap table impact and all that. And some of that, I think, came from those government programs. So a year from now, what does a company look like? If we're doing this again right after New Year's next year, what do you think we'll be talking about?
That's a great question. And this is like favorite topic as a founder, to sort of predict the future. And obviously, as founders, we're notorious for being overly enthusiastic or optimistic, but our focus really is going to be on scaling up. So I think first and foremost, we're going to go from the great team that we are to hopefully double in size and recruiting a lot of very smart, talented individuals. So growing the team is a huge priority. And then building out our pilot capabilities, our pilot manufacturing facility, which, like I said, we'll have more to share about that very soon. But hopefully our facility is operational in 12 months' time, and we'll be able to start giving tours, start seeing product come off that line. And really the goal is to validate our technology. So we're very, very excited about not just what our technology can produce from a product perspective, but we're very excited about its inherent scalability. We think that fundamentally this technology, unlike some of the other newer technologies that are coming out, I think this is fundamentally rooted in a scalable technology, and we intend to prove that out over the next year.
Right. Yeah, we agree. That's why we invested. This looks like it has potential to get big, and food is a lot of people. So if you've got salmon and people want it, you have to satisfy a big market, which is the opportunity, but also the challenge. So let's pledge ourselves to do that. Let's pledge ourselves to open next year, and we'll do the same time next year. We'll start doing that kind of thing. And and talk about where you are. We're delighted to be investors. We think this is an important area. We think the world needs it. And we're very keen on what you've done so far. So can't wait to see what happens next.
Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. Same time next year sounds great. And I really appreciate your commitment and your fund's commitment to this space.
Happy to. Talk soon. Can't wait till I get a chance to try some samples.